applied in whatever situation the church finds itself in. And so why are we really even debating this particular subject? Because Christianity does not make a claim that Christians are supposed to look outwardly like Jesus or behave like him in a cultural context. If in fact, I would ask our Muslim friends, if Jesus is but a Rasul of Allah, and only a Rasul of Allah, in other words, that section in Surah 4:171 specifically is denying that there is anything beyond that calling that would mark Jesus, because that's the same section that says do not say three, so on and so forth. If he's merely a Rasul of Allah, why are we even here tonight? Why are we even talking about emulating someone? I mean, from the Muslim perspective, Jesus was just the Jewish Messiah. He was not the Messiah for all people. He was just the Jewish Messiah. So why would we even be discussing something like this? Now, it is interesting to me that Adnan had just said, well, we have a different view of Christ, we have the Quranic view of Christ, but I would like to suggest to you that you are dependent upon the New Testament for most of what you just said about Jesus. Because the Quran only mentions the name 25 times, maybe just less than 100 times total references. You're given very, very little information about Jesus. It's plain that the author of the Quran assumes that his readers are going to be familiar with the New Testament's testimony about Jesus. And so nothing is given. There's only one place in all the Quran where Jesus speaks from an identifiable historical location, and that's his cradle. And that comes from non-canonical sources, not from the New Testament sources itself. So the background material from the Islamic perspective is dependent on the New Testament and Adnan's presentation. Quoted from the Gospels, quoted even from the Gospel of John. Why? Because we have to. That's the only way we can know anything about Jesus. These sources tell us many ways in which we cannot emulate Jesus. For example, Muslims cannot emulate him in raising the dead or being virgin born, both things that are specifically affirmed of Jesus' capacities and abilities. Christians cannot emulate him in being eternally glorious in the presence of the Father, as we read only a matter of one sentence after the text that Adnan quoted from John 17:3. You have John 17:5, where Jesus shows that he is aware of his glorious pre-existence in the presence of the Father before the world was. So here is one person speaking to another person, speaking of the time in eternity when those two persons were co-glorious in eternity past. That comes right after Jesus' words of John 17:3. So whatever you do with 17:3, you've got to understand what else is said in the rest of the Gospel of John. So Christians cannot emulate him in being eternally glorious with the Father. We cannot be the Son of God. He is identified as the Son of God in each of the Gospels, and not just a Son of God, as if God has sons by the tons, as someone used to like to say, but the unique Son of God, so much so that when he used that terminology of himself in John chapter 5, the Jews picked up stones to stone him. They wanted, both John 5 and John 10 and John 8, happened a number of times, because of the uniqueness of the claim that Jesus made to be the Son of God. What is more, we cannot emulate him in bearing the very divine name Yahweh. Yahweh. Jesus is identified as Yahweh in John chapter 12. John says that Isaiah saw Jesus in Isaiah chapter 6. You go back to Isaiah chapter 6. Who was it that Isaiah saw? He saw Yahweh. The early followers of Jesus who wrote the New Testament repeatedly identified Jesus with the one divine name, the specific divine name, much more specific than what you have in Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Yahweh is the divine covenant name of God, and it is used of Jesus. We cannot emulate him in doing that. We cannot emulate him in having a people to worship us, but Jesus, in Mark chapter 14, verses 61 through 64, in his trial, quotes from the Old Testament. And when we look back at the text that he's quoting, he's talking about that situation in Daniel, where there is one who's brought before the Ancient of Days, and he is worshipped by his people. He has a people who worship him, given the highest form of worship. And so we cannot be worshipped. We have not been worshipped in heaven. We are not to be worshipped on earth. Jesus accepted the worship of his disciples and others while on earth, something that there is no way that the Islamic Jesus would ever accept, because if you accept the thesis that Jesus actually worshipped a unipersonal or Unitarian God, then Jesus would never allow himself to be worshipped.